I wanted to ask you what your thoughts about the idea that psychedelics played a role in human evolution or the evolution of our minds in some way. Are you open to that view?
Yeah, I think it's worth considering, certainly. I mean, this kind of harkbacks to Terence McKenna's, stoned ape theory, where, he put forward this idea that our ancient ancestors on the savannas of Africa, probably looking for foodstuffs, stumbled across mushrooms, magic mushrooms, and consumed them, and had a kind of leap in their kind of conscious experience, which drove their kind of evolution of their brain and mind, perhaps through some kind of synesthesia experience, whereby in a pre-linguistic human ancestor, they may not have had the capacity to name things, and then perhaps you have an experience of synesthesia, and sounds become visual objects, which happens very commonly. In fact, on psychedelics, I've done some research on that. So you may see sounds may take the shape of a rock or something, and therefore ugh may look like a rock, and therefore you got a name for a rock from that point on. That's one extrapolation of it, but it's all very interesting. I don't think it's hard to put kind of evidence under that exotic hypothesis, really, because we can't know what was going on in the minds and consciousness of our ancestors. There's potentially some evidence from the rock art. There's a theory by Lewis Williams and Dowson who suggested that all Upper Paleolithic rock art, it has what we call entoptics, these geometric patterns and motifs which recur the world over in Upper Paleolithic rock art. And these motifs are indicative of altered states of consciousness, such that we see these entoptics a lot in altered states, particularly with psychedelics, but also in some people in even in just dark spaces, or through chanting or meditation, hypnosis, or hypnagogia, we see these geometric patterns which recur in the very earliest human artwork. So there's potentially some argument there to suggest, well, this is some kind of evidence that this cultural shift we see, or this kind of the first evidence of human culture as such through art, is somehow linked to the nature of going into altered states. I would say there's better evidence, though, potentially, and that is when we look at all the kind of innovations and discoveries and inventions and so on and so forth that have come about through triggers in altered states of consciousness. So like the history of dreams, for instance, we see several Nobel Prizes whereby the insight which drove the theory or discovery came through a dream. Einstein's theory of relativity came through a dream. Niels Bohr's construction of the atom came through a dream. The guy, I can't remember his name, who discovered electrical conductance in nerves with frogs' legs came through a dream. The invention of the sewing machine needle came through a dream, and so on and so forth. Auguste Kekulé's discovery of the benzene ring came through a dream. Mendeleev's discovery of the periodic table, which preceded Kekulé's discovery of the benzene, came through a dream. And then we can see a continuity of those innovations and discoveries through psychedelics as well. So it's suggested that Francis Crick had his DNA double helix structure discovery through the consumption of LSD. Now, we don't know if that's true because the story came after he died. We do know he did love LSD. I have that on good authority from a colleague of his who was involved in this organization called SOMA, which was about more sensible policies around drugs and psychedelics. And he also put on masked bulls apparently at his house with bowls of LSD punch at the door. So that was a bit of a giveaway. But whether or not he took it in 1953, we don't know. But we do know people like Kary Mullis, for instance, who also won a Nobel Prize for genetic discovery, in this case PCR, polymerase chain reaction. That came to him through his use of LSD, and we have him on record saying that. So there's a litany of discoveries, particularly in chemistry and physics and inventions and innovations and so on, coming through altered states of consciousness. So that would suggest that these are good cultural drivers. They're good drivers of innovation. No doubt related to the fact that they do give you this what we might call in psychology diversive thinking, so you kind of have greater associations of novel thoughts, and you can piece things together in new ways which you may not have thought about prior to being in that state of consciousness. I was actually involved in running a clinical drug trial with LSD with top-level scientists, with a view to looking at their creative problem-solving insights. I can't tell you anything about the results of that because they're still embargoed, other than I think they all thought they got some good insights out of it. I can't tell you anything about the actual specific quantitative results, however. So I think, psychedelics and all altered states are drivers of creative problem-solving, which are drivers of at least cultural innovation and cultural growth, rather than necessarily physiological evolution. But at the current time in history, our cultural evolution has far surpassed our physical evolution. So that it's becoming increasingly more important, perhaps, whether or not they actually drove physiological evolution in our ancient past. They're certainly driving cultural evolution now. Just to give you some more examples, Silicon Valley home computing industry, it's well attested that the home computing industry was largely fueled by the use of psychedelics. Steve Jobs, creator of Apple, said it was one of the most 2 or 3 important things he did was taking LSD. Bill Gates also took LSD. However, Steve Jobs said he didn't take enough, or his products would be more interesting. But there's a good book called What the Dormouse Said, which documents the use of psychedelics in the start of the home computer industry. And we also see innovations in physics as well. The fundamental physics groups were a bunch of out-of-work physics postdocs who took up theoretical physics because they couldn't get grants to do lab work. And they're also taking huge quantities of psychedelics and experimenting with parapsychology. And they developed quantum cryptography, which is now a multi-billion-dollar industry. So that came out of physicists taking acid.
I read a book about those guys once, said how the hippies saved physics.
Exactly. Yeah, that one and What the Dormouse Said are good insights into some of the less obvious cultural drivers. We know about the influences on music and fashion and so on, but less so perhaps about the kind of scientific innovations.
Yeah. And you mentioned that dreams have historically been a source of a lot of inspiration, and I certainly have the sense, not so much in dreams, but I'll wake up with the answer to some question that I've been trying to figure out, and so maybe I did have a dream but I forgot it.
Yeah.
And there does seem to be this connection between the psychedelic state and dreams. They're kind of like dreaming awake in a way, to simplify the experience. Relating this back to evolution and perturbing our minds through psychedelics, I mean, that does seem to me to be fairly plausible, although difficult to prove. But on the other hand, there is this other side of this idea that sometimes people talk about, which I think is also interesting, and it's the idea that these plants and mushrooms themselves actually evolved to contain these compounds in order to essentially communicate these experiences to us. And so that when we consume them, it leads to us being more ecologically aware of our environment, which is, of course, of benefit to the plants. And so it's kind of a bit of an out there idea, but essentially is that there is an intelligent communication occurring on some level between our species and these plants, or the rest of nature in a way. And it's a fascinating idea, and yet it does seem to be much less likely to be scientifically verifiable. But perhaps not. I don't know. Maybe you take a different view on this.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, the mainstream and materialistic scientific endeavour has been very much against the notion of consciousness existing beyond human beings, for a long time. There was a recent committee at Cambridge University which decreed that actually, no, some mammals may be conscious, but, generally the materialist reductionist kind of scientific endeavour is not really favourable to the idea that there is any kind of intelligence anywhere in nature. Although there's a huge body of research now happening demonstrating intelligence in plants, that they have memory, that they can problem solve, and so on and so forth. This can't really be ignored, I don't think. So it's, first of all, you have to kind of, establish the evidence that plants can act intelligently. And then if we look a little bit more into the nature of these usually kind of plant alkaloids that are psychedelic, on occasion we have diterpenoids and things like that as well, that these kind of the kind of typical classic psychedelic alkaloids we find in plants are very, very old. They predate humans by a long, long way. They're not quite kind of a essential building blocks of life. They're what we call secondary compounds. So they've historically been around for an extremely long time. And the way in which, certainly kind of communicating with my friends who are botanists, understand these secondary compounds is that plants use them as tools of communication, either internally as in a kind of neurotransmitter or neuromodulatory way. Well, we can't talk about neurons in plants, but plants make use for internal communications through these compounds, like serotonin and so on. And also they use them for external communication with the world outside, to communicate and manipulate the exterior world. For instance, there are substances in tomatoes whereby they'll sample, if they're getting attacked by an aphid, they'll sample the saliva of the aphid and are able to identify the specific species, and then they'll release chemical pheromones to attract the specific predator for that specific species of predator for themselves. So they use these things to communicate externally for their own benefit. And so psychedelics fall into that category of substances that plants make use of. So, and it may be that they've evolved to work in various ways. There was recently, was it a kind of fungus? I can't remember what it is. There's some kind of psilocybin was found in this fungus which takes control of an ant.
I think it's cordyceps.
Cordyceps, that's it. Yeah. For its own purposes. So, they may be used as mind control agents for insects or for repelling insects in certain circumstances, but they may also have evolved for direct communication with other species like mammals and humans in some way. And I think it's, all right, what is the purpose of that for their benefit? That's a big question mark against that. I mean, if you look at kind of people's reports, people like Paul Stamets, who's probably one of the world's leading mycologists, he would argue that psilocybin mushrooms use psilocybin directly to communicate with us and say, come on, wake up, you monkeys, you're wrecking the place. Just kind of, you're going to ruin it for everyone. You've got to you're part of an ecology of consciousness, and you've got to just stop this crazy ecocide, So he says that they're using it on a really communicative level. Obviously, that takes us into a kind of animistic realm, but I don't think we should readily dismiss that just because it doesn't fit with some kind of constricted worldview where that kind of stuff doesn't happen. That's not a good reason to kind of throw out the baby with the bathwater, really. I think we should approach these things open-mindedly, We genuinely are in some kind of ecological crisis, and, psychedelics do seemingly on face value, communicate with us and alert us to those kind of issues and make us more ecologically orientated. I've done some research with the survey and found that, psychedelics were great drivers of eco-consciousness. I found that 100% of people in my survey said they felt more connected to nature from their psychedelic experiences. Most of them were also more concerned because of their psychedelic experiences. It also kind of reflected in their behavioral changes. So the majority of people said they had changed their diet as a result of their psychedelic experiences, to be more vegan or local or vegetarian or whatever, or organic. Over 50%, the majority had also said they'd increased the amount of gardening they do as a result of taking psychedelics, So, and even a small percentage, like 16%, changed their careers to one that was more ecologically orientated. To give you an example, 2 people gave up what they were doing and took up PhDs in botany specifically because they'd tripped once and they were like, oh my God, we've got to do something about this, So I think the evidence would suggest, at least whether or not we maintain an animist perspective on these things, that they do change attitudes and behavior in a more kind of biospheric way, you know, towards the whole kind of planet, not just to the specific species that are kind of making us trip, but also those, you know. Certainly the existence of psilocybin-containing mushrooms is probably rapidly developed, you know, as a consequence of them being psychedelic. You know, there's people growing them in their droves.
It's serving them quite well, isn't it?
Yeah, serving them pretty well, I would say, whatever the nature of animism or not. But, you know, I think we should keep an open mind to those kind of interpretations as well.
Hi everyone, that was a clip from my conversation with psychologist David Luke on the Waking Cosmos podcast. For new listeners, Waking Cosmos is a philosophical podcast focusing on the mystery of consciousness and the nature of reality. If you want, you can listen to the whole episode on our YouTube channel, Meta Rising, and of course you can now listen to Waking Cosmos on Spotify, SoundCloud, Apple Podcasts, and other places I would imagine too. One last thing, Waking Cosmos is community funded, so if you would like to support the continued existence of this podcast and keep the lights on here at Waking Cosmos, please consider subscribing over on our Patreon page at patreon.com/wakingcosmos. Thank you.